Welcome to an exclusive FMI learning event. The Financial Management Institute is the leading source in Canada for professional development in new and emerging trends, best practices, and topical issues related to public sector financial management. We're a nationwide organization that has expanded over the years to include provincial and municipal public sector perspective in our numerous chapters all across Canada.
The FMI delivers a comprehensive program of learning and professional development through various events such as seminars, workshops, webinars, and publications. As an industry-leading organization, the FMI is able to attract leaders and experts who regularly contribute to the FMI learning experience. Whether it's our flagship learning events, a regional session across Canada, a monthly interactive webinar, or any of our publications, the FMI provides a venue for these partners to communicate their knowledge and experience.
The integrity and the reputation of the FMI brand allows for premium networking opportunities. Our members and attendees are able to raise their profile and take advantage of connections and contacts with industry experts and individuals in their field of interest.
Today's FMI is the result of contribution of many volunteers, individuals like you and I who decided to get involved. Listen to some of the benefits that our volunteers have experienced from their time with the FMI.
The benefits of volunteering are professional and personal.
The networking, meeting with people.
You couldn't ask for a better contact in making contacts and learning as to what's going on.
It affords volunteers great exposure.
Definitely it will improve your leadership capacity.
A lot of learning opportunities.
But mostly it's the people.
Go ahead and get involved because you couldn't ask for a better asset on your resume as well.
In order to continue our growth and renewal, we're constantly seeking to engage members in our community.
If you are interested in growing your own career, working with dynamic people, while at the same time giving back to the community, then you should consider volunteering with the FMI.
Speak to one of the organizers or visit the volunteer section of our website for more information. Enjoy your exclusive FMI learning event and join us in striving for excellence in public sector financial management.
Welcome to Expand Your Horizons, the Financial Management Institute's webinar series designed to promote excellence in public sector financial management. My name is Saj Nair. I lead the cyber resilience practice for the financial services sector at PwC. And this is a hot topic that my clients raise on almost a daily basis. As we see the business world transform based on technology-led innovation, more digitization and hyperconnectivity, there's plenty of opportunities out there for businesses to take advantage of. But we're seeing more and more cybersecurity is a risk top of mind as well and can undermine some of those advantages that digital innovation presents to us. So with that said, I'm happy to present to you two leaders in the cybersecurity community who will be walking us through some of their thoughts on cyber threat protection and prevention. So that said, before we get too far down, there's a couple of things from a housekeeping perspective I'd like to go through. Firstly, there will be a Q&A at the end of this presentation. Feel free to submit your questions throughout the presentation. They will be gathered and we will use it for the Q&A portion at the end. You can submit your questions in the question box on the right-hand side of your screen. If you have any technical issues, click the raise your hand button and we'll do our best to address it. Today's webinar will last approximately an hour, including the Q&A at the end of the presentation. Moving on to the next slide. Now I'd like to introduce everyone to our panelists. So we've got two great panelists here, Mr. Scott Jones and Mr. Evan Willers. Scott Jones is the Director General of Cyber Defense with CSEC. Cyber Defense is responsible for defending systems of importance to the Government of Canada from cyber intrusion. Prior to this role, Scott was the Director General of Cyber Defense Operations and Capabilities Development. Scott was also seconded to the Privy Council Office as a National Security Policy Advisor in the Security and Intelligence Secretariat. Scott holds a Bachelor of Applied Science in Electronic Systems Engineering and a Bachelor of Science in Computer Science. He completed a Master's of Business Administration in General Management from the University of Ottawa. And our second panelist here is Evan Willers. He spent 15 years working in public policy and research roles across a range of sectors. A politics and economics postgraduate, he spent his formative career working with a number of professional bodies, influencing the UK and EU agendas on issues as diverse as planning law, climate change, urban regeneration, economic development, and state aid. He also led the respected Building Futures think tank, an influential thought leader in the world of construction and architecture. Swapping the world of property for financial sector, he joined ACCA in 2010, taking up the role of policy director. Since this time, ACCA has transformed its research and insights program, which is a key part of the organization's global engagement strategy. Evan and his team ensures that ACCA maintains a leading voice in the political and business debate surrounding the future of accountancy profession, helping to shape the role that accountants play in the business and society at large. A big focus of ACCA's research and advocacy program has been understanding the drivers of change that are shaping the accountancy profession and the world of business and finance more widely. The significant and disruptive influence of technology, the greater use of non-financial data, enhanced analytics, and the issues that surround these developments, such as effective data management and ensuring cybersecurity, have been a core element of innovative research that ACCA has been developing in recent years. Research projects such as Digital Darwinism, Big Data, Its Power and Perils, and 100 Drivers of Change have provided thought-provoking and influential insights into what future holds for the profession and challenges and opportunities it faces. So that's it. The title of today's webinar is Cybersecurity, Threat and Prevention. So with that said, I will now turn over to Mr. Jones to commence the presentation.
Great, thank you very much. So I'm really pleased to be here today to talk to you about CSE and what we see on the Government of Canada, but I want to take a different perspective. So first of all, what my organization is responsible for is really, we have a three-part mandate. The foreign intelligence part is really what gives us our edge in terms of understanding what threats we face as a nation from outside in terms of cyberspace. And then the organ part that I represent is about IT security. And we've gone through a fundamental shift over the last few years, which is, this was all about technology before. And we made this about technology because the only people who would listen were basically CIOs and the technologists. And so we developed a vocabulary that was very much inaccessible. And now what we're hoping to do is make this accessible, because this really isn't about technology anymore. This is about business and this is about risk. And that's what we're going to talk about through today. So in terms of the Government of Canada, the Government of Canada is about 350,000 people spread across the nation, hitting every sector of the Canadian economy in one way or another. And it is pervasively targeted. Tens of millions of times a day our networks are probed with people trying to figure out ways in. They are after anything you'd think of. Basically, trade secrets, new technologies, negotiating strategies, our personal information, or natural resources information, anything that could give them a leg up, or anything that could give them an advantage. And no one in the Government of Canada is immune. We've seen every single government targeted, every single government department targeted, and it's the same across the public spectrum as well, from what we've seen with some of the people we work with, whether it be with Public Safety Canada or some of the partners in the private sector. And the fact is, what we'd like to tell the rest of the government, and it holds true, you're either a victim or you just don't know that you have already been a victim. And so the threats are varied. I don't think most of this will come as a shock, but cyber exploitation and intrusions are within the reach of many. And it doesn't take an incredibly technologically savvy organization or person to address this. And so we have, from what we term script kiddies, these are the people who are out there for fun in a lot of cases. They're out there to make a point or just to do something because they can. The tools are there for download. They can buy them. They don't even have to buy them, and they can run it. And we've seen some examples of that this last year, in terms of somebody with relatively little knowledge use that to gain access. Hacktivists who are usually looking out for disruption, they're really looking for embarrassment, something to draw attention to their cause. They're going to do some damage, but probably more reputational damage than actual physical. Cyber criminals are out there to steal. They're there to get your personal information. They want to get private information. They want to get credit cards. They want to be able to make a profit off of this data. We've seen in the last few weeks major healthcare providers compromised. Certainly this is something that they're targeting governments for, whether you're in the provincial, municipal, or federal sector, and private sector organizations. And then finally, the ones that we would like to consider the most sophisticated, but not necessarily. They're as sophisticated as they need to be to compromise our networks, and that's the states, and they're really out there for intelligence gathering, some to a certain amount of disrupt or destruction, but the fact is they're all out there. We've had some very public disclosures in the last year in terms of state-sponsored actors, but the fact is all of these threats are there, and they're all effective, and it's something we have to be prepared for. So in reality, we've treated this, as I said before, as an IT problem, and we viewed it like the Y2K problem. So we wanted to spend our way out of this. So give me enough, I just want to give you enough money, make this problem go away, and then I can move on to the other things that are important. And that's really how it was positioned for a long time. IT really isn't some place where we want to talk about. It's an enabler, it's a cost center, it's a place where money goes to be spent, but the fact is cyber risk is much more pervasive than that. And this is really about the organization and business risk, and I've listed a few there. There's certainly much more detailed information available in terms of risks to organizations that I think will be talked about a little bit later, or that are certainly available on the web. But the fact is the prevention of these cyber compromises really depends on a partnership with the technology. IT organization or the technology service providers. The incentives that IT has provided aren't aligned with these risks. So the incentive is really usually lowest cost compliant. Or the way I describe it is IT is kind of like air. We expect it to be there, and when it's not, we get really angry and just make it work. And user features are the only thing that matters. And so when you're looking at those as the incentives, where's security in that? How do you measure security? What about the risk to the organization's data, the reputation? Because the fact is lowest cost compliant doesn't mean that it's going to have security or it's going to be thought about. It's going to deliver the base functionality and that's it. And so IT really needs to change how it approaches projects, but users need to, and the stakeholders need to change how they approach IT and bring those in as part of the evaluation or the establishment of any project or program. And while I don't really want to dwell on technology, the fact is that in the Government of Canada in 2013, every single compromise was preventable by simply updating the software that was out there and in use. There is no quick fix for cybersecurity, but the fact is when we go through and we look at the incentives in the government, this is not incentivized. What's incentivized is uptime, features, and that costs us because every time there's a compromise, it requires a physical response. Systems administrators have to go out and do work. It's overtime. It is significant cost to the organization, but it's a one-time cost. And we're talking about years of investment. And so how do we measure the investment in IT? How do we measure proactivity? And how do we encourage that are all questions that need to be brought in when we're looking at a technology, not necessarily did you deliver the 5 features that you were supposed to in the time you were expected to deliver. But the fact is that everybody, no matter what you spend on IT and how advanced your defenses are, if somebody wants in, they will get in. There is no perfect security system other than disconnecting, which means you need to be prepared. And what does that mean? What's the cyber response plan? What are you going to do if something's compromised? Do you know what your critical data is? Do you know where it's located? Do you know what is actually private data and what is the special sauce for your organization? And most organizations are going to answer no. And that's a huge challenge because the fact is that you can't protect everything. There is no, the Maginot Line approach to security, which people have been trying to promote, meaning having hard exterior shell with a soft GUI center, they will get through that shell. So how do you harden your network? How do you harden your information? How do you defend it and protect it? And how do you respond if there actually is a breach. And so there are a number of best practices in use in terms of what can you do. And we've issued one for the Government of Canada, but it certainly is applicable across, and it's the recently published top 10, the top 10 measures you can take to secure your network. It's available on our website, but the fact is that the top 10 is because these are the ones that the threat actors are actually exploiting today. And so those are all accessible, and they're all doable, and they can all be measured in terms of implementation. And so I think those are key things that need to be taken into account when looking at action and starting to change the incentives in this space. But the fact is that technology was always something we looked at to be another person's problem. In a past job, it was actually my problem. But the fact is that this really is, cybersecurity is really about understanding your business and your organization and the information that's there. Because IT doesn't really understand what's the most sensitive information. And they can't do the risk assessment on what the business value will be if it's lost. And I'll use business value in a generic term, not necessarily just a private sector context. Any public organization that's gone through a cyber compromise can tell you that the loss of reputation, the media, unwelcomed media attention being paid to an organization that's compromised, the loss of confidence in your stakeholders, those are all things that it's not going to be IT that deals with the consequences. And so working together is really key. Understanding, working with the private sector, with the public sectors, the private, like the federal government, Public Safety Canada, ourselves, strengthening overall our technology, but also strengthening the information sharing. So it shouldn't be a bad thing that a cyber compromise was caught. It should be a bad thing that an organization wasn't prepared. And so if an organization is prepared, everybody is going to get compromised. The fact is, you can minimize the cost, and you can minimize the impact, and you can maximize the ability to return to business and normal operations. And so we just have a few key measures or messages here. And really, it's understanding the network and information. It's always going to be constantly targeted. Your organizations hold information of value. I know a lot of the public sector organizations will say, but it's all accessible under access to information anyway. But that doesn't take into account the private information of Canadians or of customers. It doesn't take into account the fact that there are still proprietary pieces of information that aren't public yet. And it's not that we want to hold everything secret and keep it in a little lockbox. It's about knowing that there are times where information needs to be protected for competitive good, and people trust us with information. They trust all of you with information. And so, what are the key questions? What are the right questions that should be asked? Because I was looking through some previous audits from different organizations or evaluations of some IT projects, and almost every single one of the ones I read was looking for value for money in relation to features. How much did feature X cost me, and how much did this overall project cost? There was no discussion of security, there was no discussion of risk, there was no, beyond the project not delivering on time. We all know that IT projects are notoriously expensive, notoriously behind, and honestly, absolutely, money pits in a lot of cases. Let's be honest here. The fact is that the right questions now need to be, did this project prepare for a compromise? Has security been built in from the start? Is security something that's being measured? And if outsourcing is a strategy that's being undertaken, does the outsourcing contract have clauses that include security measures as well? So the fact is, if you've outsourced your infrastructure and the security provider isn't keeping it up to date, whose reputation is that? It's probably not going to be the outsourcer. It's your customers and your information, or your clients, or your government, or your citizens. And so those are the key questions that we need to be looking at. We need to be looking at the risks, and that's kind of a quick overview of what we're seeing from the government and where we're taking things. But the fact is, it's pervasive, it's there, and it's not going away anytime soon.
Great stuff, Scott. Do you want me to continue?
Yes.
Will do. This should provide you a little bit more of an international context in terms of where we are with cybersecurity and also the role of finance, because it is a growing issue for CFOs and the finance team. And I think that there's a view, certainly from ACCA, from our research, that finance needs to become much more active in this space. And as Scott said earlier, not just leave it to IT. We've been doing a lot of research looking at things like tech and data and cybersecurity and how it's affecting the future of the profession. Hopefully I can draw on that as well. Just to give you a little bit of a summary of some of the research findings that we've identified already. Of course, it's absolutely crucial to understand the nature and the likelihood of cyber threats, and I'll look in a moment at the fact that accountants are much more aware of cybersecurity. That's not to say they're all actioning that awareness, but at the moment they're certainly aware of the threats and the implications for the businesses they work in. Absolutely needs to be thought of in terms of risk, both how to understand and assess those risks, how to mitigate those risks as well. And of course, at the heart of what a finance team is about is around control and ensuring the policies are there to govern the organisation effectively, and this goes to data too. So it's in terms of making sure that there's privacy, security, and security is paramount in all of that. There's a growing need to educate users on these emerging risks, not only in terms of the very sophisticated risks, and some of those that Scott mentioned are very much sophisticated international risks, but also at a low level, issues regarding patches to software. And in fact, the fact that we all carry around a smartphone now, which often has quite privileged access to an increasing array of business data, that's one of the main routes actually that we're seeing security issues emerging from business, is actually the loss of mobile devices, mobile technology, which perhaps isn't as well protected through passwords, through security patches, through encryption and so on that you might like. So remember that your technology is a route through to your data, so that's a key thing to protect. Absolutely, we need to plan for increasing complexity. I'll come back to that in a moment. And crucial in all of this is really to make sure that not only is cybersecurity not solely the preserve of IT, for all the reasons that Scott outlined there, it's an important part of the question, but it's not really the part of the business that has that complete overview of the data, the sensitivity of the data, the business value of that data, and therefore the element of risk. But we want to get CFOs driving cybersecurity strategy. We want that conversation to happen at board level because it's a really fundamental risk to both public and private organisations. And at the moment, too often cybersecurity is something that's farmed out as an expensive, probably, solution that IT are going to lead on. That's something that we want to challenge. So let's have a look at the international context. This is a survey that we undertook amongst our members 2 years ago. So we had 2,000 responses from around the world, and this was part of a project looking at the drivers of change, and you'll find the link on the website. So we were asking, what are the issues that are going to most impact on business and the profession over the next 2 to 3 years? So this is over the short term. Interestingly, the top issue for all three sectors, both large and small corporates here and the public sector, was fuel and energy prices, and that was to the increasing fuel and energy prices. Now recently I suspect that we'd see the flip side of that, and that the concern is around lower fuel and energy prices and the economic issues there. So we can see it's a dynamic issue. But second, in terms of concerns, and this is consistent across these sectors, was cybersecurity challenges. And you'll see globally the public sector was the most concerned of the sectors in terms of the risk that it'll have and the effect that it's going to have on the profession, the need for the profession to engage in this issue. So it's a global and cross-sectoral issue. And actually in terms of the global picture, the concerns were fairly consistent around the world, but you'll see a number of differences here. I think there's a great deal of awareness that needs to be raised in Central and Eastern Europe looking at this. Having said that, there are clearly areas where there's a greater awareness. Now, awareness is a great starting point, and you can see there's awareness around the world, but turning that awareness into concrete action and a plan to mitigate and protect against cybersecurity is the next step. Awareness is a good starting point, but it's not the end point we need to aim for. So I'm going to come back here to an issue that lies right at the heart of a lot of our research, and that's to identify how the role of finance professionals is changing in business. And we've seen quite a significant shift over the last decade and more, and that's continuing now, and I'll just unpick that for a moment. So perhaps accountancy and finance comes from a position that focused on control and stewardship and reporting, but increasingly the role of CFOs and the role of finance teams in all organisations has been much more about supporting strategic direction, identifying opportunity, increasing value, and that entrepreneurial spirit is absolutely a crucial balance with that control, reporting and stewardship responsibility. So it's a really fine balance to take. It's not good enough that we focus on the strategic entrepreneurial aspect, neither solely on the control and stewardship. The two things have to be in balance. But the thing that's really driving change at the moment is the emergence of non-financial data being of much more importance to the finance team, and actually data generally, and in particular big data, and these new, much more personal data points about consumers and clients shared throughout a supply chain. These are being much more important to a business in terms of driving decision making, but that very data increases the risk, increases the actual risk, the level of risk should you be compromised, and also holding more data in lots of different places at the moment, which is what we tend to see. Lots of legacy systems, lots of compartmentalized data. That actually increases risk because you're not having a whole organisation-wide approach to cybersecurity. So accountants are being asked to extract insight and value from data. Absolutely, that's about identifying ways to be more efficient, identifying what your consumers want, understanding your markets better, understanding the needs of citizens, but absolutely finding a balance with managing, securing and providing assurance over that data through the business. From the time when you acquire that data all the way through the management, the storage, the analysis section, and actually what you do with it at the end. There's a lot of data that organisations think have been purged and deleted from their systems, and it still exists somewhere, and that's an issue. So what we tend to be moving towards, I think, is a data-driven organisation, a data-driven finance function. And so what that means for the finance function is that it's using this much wider array of data, often very sensitive data, both sensitive to the business, sensitive to the consumer, sensitive to the citizen, using that to firstly provide data leadership. So we want to drive CFOs and the finance team to think much more widely about what the strategy is for data, both in terms of how it's identified and used, how you extract value from it, but also how it's protected. So that's organisation-wide perspective of data as something that ought to be coming, at least with the finance team very heavily involved, if not right at the forefront. That will enable organisations to make better decisions. It'll improve decision making, not only for finance, but right across organisations. But alongside that, of course, we have to manage the regulatory environment, both in terms of reporting, but also the regulation around cybersecurity and privacy are emerging very quickly. Also, the public view of what is sensitive and the reputational risk that Scott mentioned is absolutely critical to understand too. It's not just about whether you're breaking the law by making that information too freely available, by not securing it, but actually the reputational risk will follow that. So we need to enhance control and risk management capabilities, and also use that information to improve cost efficiency and lowering the cost to serve of a business. So great, using data is fantastic, but the way that we do it at the moment is flawed. So we often use our internal organisational data through an enterprise resource planning system, but even that at the moment, it struggles to integrate supply chain data, it struggles to integrate customer data, and when you're not integrating it, firstly you lose veracity and consistency of your data in that organisation, but of course you're also prone to being more open to cybersecurity risks as well. There are reporting challenges, which is not really something we're focusing on so much now, but big data, as I say, is something that's driving a much bigger awareness of cybersecurity risk, because that non-financial data, often data that's coming from outside of the organisation, organisations are seeking to have those insights into what's happening in customers' lives, citizens' lives, and that is highly secure, or needs to be highly secure. It's highly sensitive data. So perhaps what we need to be looking at, and I think in Canada with the shared service move, where we're hoping to integrate a number of different storage and analytics systems across the public sector, we're seeing that in a number of different organisations and sectors around the world. So it's beginning to create a unified data ecosystem whereby an organisation has a clear view of what data it holds, what the sensitivity and risk of that data is, and it maintains consistency with its general ledger and that financial information at the heart of the ERP system. But by having a unified outlook on that data, it enables an organisation to be much more data agile. It needs to be able to share information through the supply chain and across the organisation with a consistency and an assurance that data is accurate and consistent. And it should also enable better cybersecurity, because you can build a hard shell around that rather than a series of legacy systems. However, the risk is perhaps increased because if you do manage to crack that system, the fruits of your labour as a cyber criminal perhaps are even more advantageous. And so we need to be aware of the risks of going down this route. And this is a route that we're seeing leading organisations, data-driven organisations already taking on. So what does this particularly mean for public sector organisations? Well, as I mentioned earlier, yes, there are organised attacks and they're going to increase in frequency, they're going to increase in sophistication, but you need to think about the fundamentals as well. Do you have those patches? Are they updated immediately? Because we know that criminals around the world are aware that public sector organisations sometimes struggle to patch their software, to patch their unsecured systems as quickly as they might like, and they target that window. So make sure that you're very clear about passwords, encryption, and actually be aware, make sure your staff and your supply chain are aware of the risk around smart technology, laptops, smartphones and so on. Be aware of big data and that using a wider array of data points is going to increase risk and present new challenges. But I can't say that we're going to shy away from using non-financial and big data because the opportunities are absolutely enormous. So we have to just be aware of that risk and manage that risk as we go forward. That centralised data ecosystem, that organisation-wide view of data, how it's managed and how it's secured, is absolutely critical. We're seeing that as an emerging best practice. However, be aware of those risks, because if you're pooling your data, then once you crack it, then of course you've got to make sure that you compartmentalise that and you put internal security partitions and so on in place. Absolutely not just an IT and technology issue. It's a board level issue, and we want finance to be at the forefront. We want CFOs to make this part of their agenda, and I don't see enough CFOs doing that at the moment, unfortunately. Be aware of the implications of social technology, mobile and cloud. Cloud's a fantastic system. It can be immensely secure, but that information exists somewhere. And so if you're not working with your cloud supply chain, with perhaps your partner's cloud supply chain as well, because you may be sharing data with your supply chain, make sure that you're hardening that and you're working together in tandem to ensure that cybersecurity is maintained. And as I say, make sure that you turn awareness of the issues into action and into leadership. Awareness is fine, but it doesn't really do anything. Being aware is the starting point. You need to build on that into a firm action plan that goes back to the fundamentals. What is the data that you hold? What kind of systems do you have? Where are the sensitivities of that data? Where are the risks? And are you managing them effectively, not only from an IT point of view, but right across the organisation? Very briefly, a couple of future challenges in terms of what we see coming up. The Internet of Things, you might have heard of it. It's going to create ever more data, ever more personal and sensitive data. It's going to grow in volume and complexity, and that's going to create further challenges. So we all want to embrace big data. We all want to use it to make our organisations smarter and more effective. But we have to make sure that we've got that in mind in terms of the dangers that go alongside that, the risks. Secondly, regulation and public concerns. There isn't a clear view in a lot of organisations at the moment in terms of what is public and what is private data. I'm not sure there's a clear view in the minds of the public in terms of what's public and what's private. And so organisations may well be keeping in keeping with the regulation and the law, but are we keeping in terms of public views of what's appropriate? And the reputational risks of cybersecurity breaches, as we've seen in the last couple of years, are absolutely critical. And so you will damage your public perception and the faith and the trust that the public have in your organisation, whether you're public or private sector. And that's only going to increase. As Scott mentioned, I don't want to minimise this. Sophisticated attacks are inevitable. They happen every single day. They are only going to increase in complexity and severity and frequency. So be aware of what's happening. This is not a one-stop solution. You need to be constantly vigilant of what's happening, the emerging threats, the new software issues that you're going to have to face as an organisation. And remember, this is an asymmetric situation. As an organisation protecting your data, you have to succeed every single time there's an attack. As someone trying to get hold of that information, you have to succeed once. So keep on top of what's happening, keep on top of technology, on top of data, be aware of the emerging risks and the new sophisticated attacks. And there's a final point, and it's not just about international collaboration, although I think that's very important. We see too much where an organisation is working in segments within departments. We want to see a cross-organisational approach. In government, that can be quite difficult. We need to work in tandem across different departments, across different organisations. But even more so, we need to work through the supply chain. We need to work in tandem with partners right across different sectors as well, because this is a common threat, a national threat, and actually we need to work internationally. We've seen recently that these are sometimes nationally driven threats. I think that global businesses obviously have different approaches sometimes in different national jurisdictions. They probably shouldn't have, but they do. So we need to make sure that we're working across an organisation, across a sector, through the supply chain, and actually on an international basis. I want to see this on the agenda of the G20 at some point. I haven't seen it yet, but I hope to in the future. So this is a dynamic threat, it's a dynamic issue. We want to see CFOs right at the heart of it. We think that finance professionals need to be not only aware, but really taking action on this, working together with IT. I don't want to diminish the role of IT, but I do want finance professionals to be thinking about this and have it high on their agenda in the coming years, because it's a critical issue and it's one that's not going to go away. I guess we're over to questions.
Absolutely. So there's been a lot of questions pouring in. It's a quietly active audience out there. So it's comforting to know people are actually watching this. Before we dive into questions, there's a couple of things that really resonated with me, so I wouldn't mind just quickly recapping on that. I think, Scott, starting with you, I think you mentioned that this is absolutely a business issue, not just a technology issue, and that certainly from my perspective resonated really well. I'm seeing more and more mature organizations are absolutely taking that business-led approach, and as you mentioned, business is in the best position to value the data. Technology can support with the protection of that data, help with the detection and the response, but business ultimately can help technology prioritize where you can focus. So I thought that was really great message there. The other thing that resonated, which Scott and Evan, you both touched on, is this is a team sport. You can't fight this alone. The bad guys out there actually are really good at collaborating. They share their tools and techniques, whereas us good guys within the organization and also between the organizations, I think we have a bit of work to do, and I see that improving every day. But it was really comforting to hear that this is absolutely a team sport. The other bit, Evan, you mentioned was around being a data-driven organization and taking advantage of that. I think that's absolutely critical. Ultimately, you're here to protect that data, be it financial or non-financial. There's value associated with that. So how do you actually factor that into your overall data ecosystem is critical. And big data certainly presents a lot of opportunity from a business perspective. It can be a risk as well, because now all that insights that you're generating could be exploited potentially. But at the same time, we're also seeing trends out there where big data could be used for detection. So you can use that for clever analytics to detect some of the sophisticated attacks out there. And finally, the asymmetric nature of the attacks, it's completely spot on. As a defending organization, you need to be successful every time, whereas as an attacker, you just need to get through once, and that may be it. So with that said, that was really great presentations. I'll jump to the Q&A. There's lots of questions here, so I'm going to pick some of the tough ones so we can put Scott and Evan to test here. Let's see. So the first one I've got here is the cybersecurity strategy. So when you consider a cybersecurity strategy, especially within a finance team or initiated out of a finance team, like where do you get started? Scott, do you want to have a go at that first?
I think it's really understanding what's valuable that you hold. You really need to understand what your assets are, and then you can talk about what do you need to do and what are the risks your organization faces. What happens if those are stolen? What happens if they're breached? What are your major risks as an organization from that point? And then you can start to develop your strategy. How are you going to respond? How are you going to mitigate those risks, or bring them to an acceptable level where I'm not saying invest an ungodly amount of money no matter what's asked for. It's to bring it within an acceptable range, and that depends on your organization. So some organizations, like you said, you have to succeed 100% of the time defending, and so that's a situation many government organizations will find themselves in with private information. A single data breach is an embarrassment that no deputy head of a federal organization wants to go through. And in other cases, there's some information that if it gets breached, well, it's not good, But really, what was the long-term business value? The value, the long-term length of the data, or of the information that was taken. So it's really understanding your risks. How do you mitigate? And then you can talk about mitigation strategies and what's your acceptable level there. I think that's the key start point for me. And then you can go from there. And there's many examples out there of what a cybersecurity response plan would look like, because it does involve also communications as well. And nothing is worse than hiding and having it exposed, your data breach exposed for you, rather than going out and being proactive. At least so I think there's a lot of elements in there, and it depends on your organization. So
I mean,
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think that's pretty spot on. The first thing I think is to be honest about the risks too. There are too many organisations who cross their fingers and hope. So it's to have an honest conversation, a realistic conversation in terms of where the risks are and what the level of that risk is. But for me, and coming from the finance point of view, I would like this to start with the CFO really taking an interest in understanding the data that is driven through an organisation. Where is that data? What kind of data does your organisation hold? Because your organisation probably has data you're not even using, but you are collating it, you're storing it, and it may well be of limited value to you at the moment, but to the outside world, to cyber criminals, to hacktivists, it might be of incredible use. So just be very clear about the nature of the data life cycle within an organisation. Just be clear about where that data is coming from, how you're keeping it, what systems do you have in use. You see too many legacy systems still in place, too many multiple systems that don't talk to each other particularly well, they don't integrate particularly well, and therefore not very protected. So just be very clear about how your data comes into the organisation, what the nature and the risk around that data is, and how you're protecting it. So take an organisation-wide view and understand the data use within your organisation.
that's perfect. And just recollecting one of the conversations I had with my clients recently, it was actually a CFO, and he mentioned that when an issue happens, we defer a lot of these issues to our CIOs, but when an issue happens, it's often the CFO or the CEO that has to front the media, or answer to the regulators or the shareholders or whoever the stakeholders are. In this case, in the government's case, it will be the citizens ultimately, or the ministers. So, it is ultimately a business issue.
Absolutely.
At the end of the day. So with that said, we agree it's a business issue. In developing the strategy, what are the different groups you should involve in actually setting that strategy? Technology obviously has a role to play, but what are the other groups that you would want to include in setting that strategy?
Well, for me, going back to the previous answer, I think once you understand the data life cycle and the flow of data through your organisation, you can be very clear of where that data is being collected, where it's being used and analysed. So it may not be the same places where that data enters the organisation. And so we'll see a lot of sales and marketing organisations, departments and so on, that have some very, very sensitive and very interesting data, very valuable data around customers, their behaviours increasingly, predictive analysis about what their customers are going to do. Of course, finance has a lot of that transactional information, but increasingly has information that is non-financial in nature and may well be sensitive to business. So identify where your data is being developed and then being used, but also think about the other partners and the other organisations that you work with. Who is your supply chain? A lot of organisations now share data down the supply chain. It improves efficiency, it improves your logistics, but if your data is being shared elsewhere, how secure is that information from your supplier, from your retail organisation, from your logistics chain? If you're using a cloud-based solution, don't just presume that they've got a plan in place. Understand intrinsically what their cybersecurity approach is. So understand your own organisation and understand the touch points of where that data is shared, and therefore where you may not control the cybersecurity of that data. So work in tandem with your supply chain.
Scott, anything to add to that?
I think that's spot on, and it's also what data do you hold that was somebody else's, right? So you're probably getting somebody else's data as well, and that's something that you've accepted a responsibility, whether it be contractual or you've got some liability issue if that data gets stolen from you. And so I think it's really understanding your data cycle. And I think in terms of groups that need to be involved, certainly there's I think the point about finance and CFOs is incredibly important. And certainly IT as being maybe possibly the defender, but really it's that C-suite or the senior level that needs to be engaged in this and looking to engage with the problem. And I really love that point about needing to have that conversation at that level, at the board level. And whether the board is in the private sector context, or we're talking about an executive committee in the public sector, in the public sector, excuse me. But also, we should be discussing this at our audit committees. Are we addressing the risks properly? When we're talking about our organizational risk plans, is it being covered? And so, and then in your response plan, what is your communication strategy? Are you going to be proactive? Because I think it is incumbent, and there's far too much secrecy in here, and the goal is to try to hide the fact that there was a breach. You're going to get exposed, and it's going to be embarrassing. And so, who's going to be the lead? And I think that all those groups need to be in I really like that data cycle point. So
I think the point you're making there around the reputational risk, really, in terms of how you communicate post-breach, and then how you learn from that breach as well from the organisation, is critical. Too many organisations are thinking about the upstream element, perhaps, around how do I harden my systems, how do I create cybersecurity, but they're caught on the hop when it actually happens to them. So there's an issue around what's the competitive advantage, what's the value in terms of the business, and again using that in the broad sense, what's the business value that's been lost, but also in terms of how do I manage that reputational risk, how do I learn from this as a business, but how do I communicate that? I think that there are very good examples recently of how that's been managed well, and perhaps some examples of how that's been managed less well, and I'll leave it up to you to decide which those might be.
Yeah, it's an interesting point you bring up, Evan, around the reputational risk, and Scott, yourself as well, is, some of the studies we're doing more and more is, there seems to be a general appreciation that this risk is increasing a lot, and therefore, breaches are the new norm. I mean, people are not surprised. It's not great, but people are not surprised, consumers are not surprised, stakeholders are not surprised when these, incidents happen. But often what determines the organization's long-term viability or reputation is how you respond and how you recover from that. And that's where I think, having that response playbooks or exercises and building your muscle memory, being prepared for that event, is quite critical. So we'll move on to, there's a few other questions pouring through, I've been jotting them down. You mentioned about supply chain and focusing specifically on cloud providers. In that context, are there any special security concerns or risks that a department or an organization needs to consider if they're moving to cloud, say for example?
I think cloud's a great solution for a lot of small businesses as well as large businesses. It's becoming an egalitarian issue, so it's opening up availability of software that maybe at the past there used to be an expensive solution for only the largest organisations. So cloud is cheapening some of these approaches. So it's a great business benefit. Obviously it enables you to be more agile and more flexible and more mobile as an organisation. But you have to remember that data is still sat there somewhere. Physically, as well as it doesn't literally sit in the cloud. There is a data bank somewhere, and you're no more secure than your cloud-based provider. So don't just go for the cheapest solution, don't just go for the solution that seems right at the outset. Go and interrogate them, go and talk to them. Not just ask them about the technical, but ask them about their approach and their opinion around cybersecurity. Ask them around how they're managing it on a day-to-day basis and what their strategy for the future is. I think too often it's a snapshot in time and you say, well, okay, you seem to be quite well protected at the moment. This is moving so fast, you have to know what their strategy is in terms of keeping on top of that cybersecurity issue. So just work with the right level of due diligence. It is a different kind of risk. It doesn't get rid of risk, it just changes your risk slightly. And it outsources that risk. So work in tandem with your cloud-based provider. Don't just buy in the cheapest solution. Really interrogate them and find out what their approach is.
And I think in the public sector we've got a few other concerns, and there are things that should be taken into consideration, but I think they're probably less valued or less important in sort of the private sector space. But that really is about data sovereignty and what jurisdiction is your data being stored in, and what access does that jurisdiction give to your data. And so your customers are giving this to you in trust. Your cloud provider might not even have to tell you that they've accessed that data for somebody else's purposes. And so it's really important that you take that into account as well. Where is this data going? That was a really good point. The cloud isn't really floating there somewhere. It is a physical server with physical disks sitting in a data center in a physical country. And that country has data access laws. And so that's something that we have to take into account. How do we protect the data that's been entrusted to us? And so I think that's an important point to add on to all the other considerations. Because certainly cloud is, there's a government initiative, Cloud First, and obviously The government is looking to partner with the private sector in terms of some of our major consolidation issues under shared services, and that's something that will continue, and I expect that in all jurisdictions. And so how can we build this so that it addresses some of those concerns as well?
But cloud won't go away. I mean,
No.
the sheer quantum of data that organisations are having to manage and store and utilise and analyse is only increasing, almost exponentially. That volume and the variety and velocity of data is increasing. So we need to make sure that we're on top of this, because it's a great solution when it works well.
Yeah, if I may, I mean, just on the cloud topic, provide a counter insight on that. From a security perspective, sometimes actually cloud can be an advantage as well. Especially when I'll give you two views. One is if you're a small organization or department, the resources that you have available from a skills or budget or technology perspective may be much less than compared to, say, a cloud provider, because they've got a larger scale of investment. This is like a revenue generating business for them, so they sometimes tend to invest more. And in that particular instance, cloud can actually provide you better security than if the data actually sat within the organization. So that's from a small organization department point of view. Even in the larger organizations and departments, actually what we find is cloud can still actually help you provide better security. It's not because the larger organizations doesn't have the spend capacity or skills, but larger organizations, because of their sheer size, is often more complex to secure as well. And again, this is where you can choose to, maybe in niche areas, use cloud to actually enhance the protection that they provide, again using the scale and the robustness that the cloud providers certainly provide. But important point in all of this is, as Evan mentioned, is you need to do your due diligence. Not every cloud provider has the same level of control, so if you can do that due diligence right up front, make sure your contracts are properly in place, but also on an ongoing basis, because their security posture will change as the threat landscape evolves as well. So
Something I'll add to that, I guess, which is very similar and often linked to that whole cloud issue, is around shared service and outsourced services. We're seeing a lot more organisations, even in the public sector, beginning to share their service, whether it's analytics and data warehouses or their front-end staff, but increasingly outsourcing that as well. So having partner organisations, often in another part of the world, doing a lot of their front-end or back-end office. And again, it's that relationship between these very close-knit supply chain partners. You need to be very clear that you've got a consistent approach through that supply chain, whether you're using cloud or physical systems.
great, so I'm just keeping track of plenty more questions coming through. All right, this is an interesting one. So from a budget perspective, any take on how much, say as a percentage of IT budget, should an organization or department be spending?
I'm looking at Scott here.
The fact is, there's a lot of studies that talk about this. I don't think there is a magic number. It's the investment needs to be tied to the risk you're willing to accept. So if you're willing to accept the fact that your data is going to be stolen and accessed, and that's something that you don't have to worry about, your budget can be zero. I don't think that's probably the case, and so that's where I think it's so important. Instead of setting an IT budget and live within it, it's really about tying it back to that financial officer, the discussion that needs to happen about risk, and saying, I need to establish the right budget to bring my risk level to an acceptable point.
It's proportionate to your risk, I think that's right.
And
I'm not sure there is an easy answer to that, to be honest. I think there's a huge variety depending on the kind of sector you're in, the kind of sensitivity of your data, and how reputationally aware you are too, and the regulation involved. Obviously there are some markets where the regulatory risk is significantly higher or lower, so that's another issue to take on board. Here I suspect that we're pretty well organised in that sense, so it's probably high up the agenda and the risk is pretty high, so that drives investment, it drives the need for investment because it raises the risk, and so proportionally your investment needs to be higher. But I'm not sure I will venture a number on that, I'm afraid.
I think the audience was really looking for an answer.
Yeah.
But I think the key
That's a
point here
politician's
is,
answer.
yeah, the key point here is, again, it's you need to engage the business and understand, what is the value of that data, and then proportionate to that, actually determine your investment. And this is ultimately, there is no 100% security, and I don't think you need 100% security either in some cases. It's more about how do you balance the risk and reward, and this is where I think engagement and that dialogue with the business comes in very handy.
There's an element, actually, I'll just come in here. There's quite an emerging element around organisations that choose to sell their data, often proprietary data, and often the law around this is quite grey. but we're seeing an increasing number of organisations who gather data for their own business purposes, whatever that might be, and actually they monetise that as a revenue stream, and they'll sell on data. As I say, I think from an ethical point of view that can be very questionable, but also from a security point of view. If you find out that that information later on is tracked back and has become unsecured, that's a real reputational risk as well. But too often organisations look at the short term, think that they can make money from selling that data on, regardless of the risk, and actually that risk can come back to them. So there are really emerging issues here. It's a really quite dynamic situation, quite a dynamic answer.
Great. All right, so the next question is specific to Government of Canada, so I'll direct that one to you, Scott.
Okay.
So for the Government of Canada, the question is, is there a central organisation that is responsible for security, or is it a combination of shared responsibilities? If you can provide an overview of that, that would be great.
So it really is a shared responsibility. So there are lead security agencies. So obviously, as the kind of the central services provider, Shared Services Canada is responsible for the front line in terms of the information security, implementing, responding to the immediate threat. We provide a role in terms of setting guideline standards and also the active defender, and so we partner with SSC. Public Safety Canada has an overall responsibility, but at the end of the day it turns to all departments. Security in the Government of Canada is responsibility of the deputy head or the deputy minister, and so those folks in those positions need to be brought up to speed and made aware of the threats that they're facing, and make sure that their organization is appropriately managing them, because the fact is that even with shared services, that doesn't eliminate the risk. Shared services only has a responsibility for a portion, and they're doing their very best to consolidate an extremely disparate infrastructure. And so every department has responsibility for security. There are other departments that, though, try to help enable the collective. And so my department's one of them. There's a group of lead security agencies like the RCMP, Canadian Security Intelligence Service, and then of course Treasury Board, who sets the policies, whether it be CIO branch or the operations side of Treasury Board as well. And so to make sure that that's addressed. So that's kind of the convoluted story. My organization, we've drawn out the kind of cybersecurity responsibilities, and we call it the wheel of confusion, because really it ends up being every single department at some point has a responsibility here. And I think that really goes to the dynamic nature of cybersecurity and of security in general. The fact is there are so many elements of this, whether it be from natural disasters and physical security up to data theft and the cybersecurity risk, that it really does need to be evolved along. And that goes back to that whole point about it being a team sport. But you can't underestimate the responsibility of a department. At the end of the day, if data is stolen from Department X, that will be the headline in the newspaper on the next morning. So departments have responsibility as well.
So ultimately it is the department.
It is ultimately the department.
And then they need to then think through, where does the data go, and therefore who touches it, and therefore the shared responsibility.
Just like any private sector organization, nobody knows their data better than the department that is entrusted with it.
Excellent. Great. One final question, since we're running out of time. So, great dialogue today. Just for the finance, the executives and stakeholders who've joined us for the webinar today, what are some of the key questions they can ask of their team or of their IT department or risk departments to actually, develop this strategy, cybersecurity strategy, and also, trigger some action in this space? Any key questions that they should start asking?
I think one key question they should ask of themselves is actually, do they have awareness of the issues? Is there, just as a starting point, our survey seems to suggest there's a fairly high level of awareness, but are individuals aware of the risks that are concerned for the organisation, for the finance team? I would also ask questions across the organisation in terms of the skills as well, because this is a fast emerging issue. We're seeing a huge amount of innovation in the kind of attacks that are happening and the sophistication of those attacks, and we need to respond in kind. So are we upskilling our teams to understand how to manage this from a technology point of view, but also from within other departments? Are they aware of how they need to upskill and be more aware of the issues in terms of how it affects their department and their working? So part of it is being around is data awareness, being clear about the kind of data and the risks that are involved, but also let's make sure we stay on top of the skills. We don't want to create a skills deficit in terms of understanding these new and emerging issues.
Scott, anything you want to add?
I would say the first thing is the board, is the executive committee aware of the threats we face as an organization? Is it talked about? Does the board or the executive committee get regular updates on the threats that they faced, or the breaches or security incidents? And I'm not saying to the nitty-gritty detail. That's obviously the responsibility of whoever's the security officer, whether it be the chief security officer or in the government context, the departmental security officer. But do they know that these things are going on? Or is it a once-a-year briefing during Cybersecurity Awareness Month? That's probably not sufficient at this point anymore. Do they know what data they're holding?
Yeah.
What is sensitive? What should they be protecting? And are they prepared? What are the risks the organization faces? Are you prepared? Do you know what's going to happen if this data gets breached? What if somebody leaves that USB stick with a whole bunch of information on a bus? Not that I'm pointing out any particular organization. Or what happens if our data systems are breached over the internet? All of those are cybersecurity issues now. Are you ready? And I think that's really the question.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for your time and thoughts and insights into this. It was really an interactive and thought-provoking discussion today. We unfortunately are out of time. I could pepper Scott and Evan with more questions, but we'll continue with that after the webinar. If there are any questions, please keep sending them through, and we'll try to maybe follow up with you offline. So with that said, thank you very much, both of you again. So just for the audience, this webinar will be available on the FMI's website for viewing in a couple of weeks. It'll be available on www.fmi.ca. The next webinar will be on March 12th, 2015. The topic will be a conversation with the new Auditor General of Nova Scotia. It will feature Mr. Michael Pickup, Auditor General of Nova Scotia. For this English language presentation, Mr. Pickup will discuss the differences between federal audits and provincial audits, as well as the evolution of the role of the Auditor General since it has become a focus of the media. Once again, the webinar will take place on March 12th, 2015 at 12 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Thank you very much for joining us today.